I get a lot of comments comparing CK2 to CK3, and for good reason. It's a sequel, after all. So in this video, I'll be examining CK2 at the 3-year mark to determine, by way of comparison, how Paradox is doing with their DLC rollout for CK3. Obviously, take this with a huge grain of salt, as CK3, being a sequel, should probably have most of these features already, but as most gamers know, that's not generally how it works. Things come, things go, but perhaps with enough complaining, we can get some of the things we want back. But anyway, Crusader Kings 2 came out February of 2012, was made free to play in October of 2019, and received its final hotfix in September of 2021. So what, 9.5 years of active development basically? In that time, the game received 15 expansion DLCs, with the first coming in June of 2012 and the final coming in November of 2018. It also received musical and graphical updates as well, but I won't be including those in this video since they feel sort of minor and mostly inconsequential in comparison to the features of an expansion. Sometimes expansions in this case would be what we would call flavor packs, but we'll get to that. Now, as I said for this video, we'll be focusing on the first 3 years of development for CK2, which had, if you can believe it, 9 expansions released between June 2012 and December 2014. Now, for the sake of comparison, CK3 had 8 DLCs released in its 3 years so far, although 2 of those are cosmetic packs, so I'm not going to count those. And technically they've rebranded, as I said, how DLCs are delivered, but I'm going to count the other 6 as expansions for the sake of simplicity. This video also does account for Legacy of Persia, but only for the sake of feature inclusion, with the caveat that it falls outside of this 3-year window by a couple months. For this next section of the video, I'll be giving a brief synopsis of CK2's 9 DLC. That's crazy. Their core features, and discussing if those features exist in CK3, be it in base game or otherwise, at the 3-year mark. Hopefully by the end we'll be able to get a better picture of CK3's status in comparison to its predecessor and determine how it's doing at the 3-year mark in comparison, if that makes sense. Whatever. Crusader Kings 2's first DLC was Sword of Islam and was released June of 2012 and introduced Muslims as a playable religion/culture, added a custom interface for them, polygamy as a marriage system, a dynasty decadence system, unique decisions and events, updated titles, and a few other minor things. It's interesting to think that something as small as playing as a Muslim lord wasn't included in base CK2, but for the most part, these features already exist in CK3, even at release, even if at a basic level, which will be a trend going forward. However, some of the more in-depth features, like those unique events and dynasty features, wouldn't see a return until Legacy of Persia, and even then, not completely. Again, since that DLC falls outside of this 3-year window, CK3 gets a kinda on a scale of included or not for this one. Sure, you could play as Muslims at launch, and polygamy plus a few other of these features were in the game at launch, but the more dynamic and fleshed out interactive features were largely absent, leaving many players to criticize the Muslim experience as, quote, like playing a European, but in the Middle East. While I personally feel Legacy of Persia went a long way to rectify many of these issues, it doesn't change the fact that the oldest DLC for CK2 didn't see its release realized fully in its sequel until over 3 years later. Expansion number 2 released in October of 2012 and was Legacy of Rome. This DLC added the ability to join factions against your liege, raise standing armies, quell revolts, raise individual large levies from direct vassals, improve your ruler's skills, gave commander traits to your selected generals, and most importantly, included a slew of features to flesh out and bring to life the Byzantine experience. This time, even more so than Sword of Islam, most of these features are actually already in CK3 and have been for quite some time, besides the levy system, which is completely different in CK3 since you can raise them all wherever you want within your realm without really any penalty, and perhaps the most important one, an interesting and interactive Byzantine Empire. I have mentioned before in previous videos just how many people are pretty much begging for these Byzantine features to be brought back over, to not only improve the Empire experience, but just to bring to life one of the most important regions of the medieval world. It is curious to me why Paradox would focus more on the minor features, while it seems, at least for the first 2 DLCs, ignoring the decisions and mechanics that gave life and flavor to these areas. Perhaps it's on purpose, done in the hope of getting players to pay for DLC that they technically have already experienced, while also improving on older mechanics to make it appear that the DLC is better than it is. I'm obviously not going to weigh in on that for myself, but it is an interesting direction and one we should keep an eye on as we progress through the next 7 DLCs. DLC number 3 was the ever-controversial Sunset Invasion, which released in November of 2012. This DLC added a random event invasion in the mid to late game where Aztecs would come from across the sea, threatening to burn the land, sacrifice the people, and spread disease, the likes of which Europe has never seen. People have their own opinion on this one. I, for one, think it's cool, but this is the first one on the list where I can say a definitive no, it is not included in CK3. CK3 has none of these features, and frankly, I'd be a little surprised if they returned in the same way. I would like to see invasions brought back and the threat of disease and death to worry about as they roam through your lands, but as it stands right now, Paradox has not deemed this sort of DLC necessary for CK3, so don't be surprised if this one doesn't make a return, or if it does in a very different way. DLC number 4 is a important one to me, and that was the Republic, which released January of 2013, and this added the ability to play as a new form of government, merchant republics such as Venice, Gotland, and Pisa. You were able to build trade posts and improve them alongside your family palace, elect Doge and manipulate the results with prestige or wealth, feud with neighboring families and republics, and also it added unique ships, skins, and a new interface. Like Sunset Invasion, this DLC is virtually nowhere to be seen in CK3, which is majorly disappointing as merchant republics are one of the more interesting parts of the medieval period, and as it stands right now, there's nothing to support the player wanting to play as one. There's no ships, there's no trade, and really there's no republics. Think of how important Venice was to the Byzantines and also their betrayal. These are both places that desperately need these features brought back. It just doesn't make sense to exclude this. The only feature we do have from this pack are feuds, which is fine. I mean, who cares, honestly? Friends and Foes is easily the worst DLC for CK3 in my opinion, and most of the time the feud system is more annoying than it is compelling. This is probably the first DLC whose absence I find personally inexcusable. To not have one of the most important political systems of the day and focus on something trivial, even though I like it, like tours and tournaments, is quite frustrating. I'm hoping, and to be honest have a strong feeling, we will see a return of republics in Chapter 3, because as it stands now, this is a giant black eye on the face of CK3 and Paradox, and I'm pretty sure they know that, so I would look to this as a very big possibility in Chapter 3. The 5th DLC was the Old Gods, and released May of 2013. This allowed players to start in the new year 867 start date as a pagan chieftain, raiding other people's lands, or as one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, and with the aid of the great heathen host, avenge his death. It also added adventurers, landless characters who could raise armies and carve out their own lands, invasions where you could rally people from the nearby tribes to join you, rebel leaders, conversion missions for the Muslim and Christians, and a new interface, skins, and so on like the other DLC. Northern Lords was the first DLC for CK3, so obviously Paradox knew that a lot of people enjoyed these features, and therefore most of them are in the game now. However, we are still missing proper Zoroastrian religions. Persia added these somewhat, but only sort of, and adventurers. Truthfully, the stuff that was left out I don't feel terribly strongly about, but it is odd that we didn't see it return. I'm a big fan of Northern Lords, as I've said in other videos, so I have no major complaints here. However, this one just also gets a kind of on the included or not scale. The 6th DLC for CK2 was Sons of Abraham and released in November of 2013. Its primary feature was being able to manipulate the Pope in various ways. Players could ask the Pope for money or favors, restore the Kingdom of Israel, interact with holy orders, send courtiers to monasteries, pick different Islamic faiths, go on a holy pilgrimage, manipulate the College of Cardinals where your cardinals could be voted to be the next Pope, your cardinals being somebody like your brother, for example, and a slew of other minor decisions and events. Okay, I've been thinking for years that the College of Cardinals needed to make a comeback because I really enjoy the idea of a cardinal owing you a favor if they get elected as Pope. But really, aside from the various random events and decisions, most of these features are also already in CK3. You can ask for money, you can interact with and even found your own holy order, although it's fairly hands-off to be fair. You can make people go to monasteries, even your own children, and with the Tours and Tournaments DLC, pilgrimages are well fleshed out with a variety of random encounters and events to give them flavor. All that said, I think the religious features that are absent are a sore spot for some people. We'll have to see what happens going forward, but it does sort of feel like Paradox's desire to put custom religions in the game has hampered the others to feel a bit samey. Rajas of India was the 7th DLC and released March of 2014. This DLC allowed players to play in India, starting in 867 if you owned Old Gods, or between 1066 and 1337 AD. Sidebar, why doesn't CK3 have more start dates? The DLC added new religions, a caste system, Indian-based experiences, elephants and jungle terrain on the map, a new interface, and unique clothing. Now, the only one that I can think of that isn't here is the caste system. Really like the Sword of Islam, this DLC just kind of gave players the option to play as someone new, but unlike Sword, wasn't as fleshed out, kind of like the Indian experience now. The only thing I think is missing is the caste system, but of course I could be wrong, and I could see it return if we see an Indian expansion for CK3, but truthfully, I feel a little indifferent to this DLC. I don't often play in India, but with such a less and expansive history, it is a little weird that they basically ported over the very basic system and have done relatively nothing to it in 3 years. Our 8th DLC is Charlemagne, which released October of 2014 and allowed players to start in the year 769 with a focus on the Frankish king himself. It also added new cultures, a chronicle system, the ability to create your own kingdoms, their own unique names, seasons, and climate, and overhauled the regency systems. As I said in the Raja section, it is bizarre to me that we only have 2 start dates as of 2023, when in CK2 you could play as, at the time of this DLC, any year between 769 and 1337. Now I don't expect all of those because frankly that's a lot to ask for, but having maybe like 4 options would be cool. Given how hugely popular this period of history is, considering who Charlemagne is, It is interesting we haven't seen anything about him. Truthfully, I'd prefer a start date around the fall of the Western Roman Empire because to me it's a super interesting time period that would lend itself well to a DLC. But as for features, most of these are already here. Regency has been expanded in CK3, and even though it feels a bit basic, we do have it. We can make our own kingdoms, and we have climate and seasons, although not weather, which I'd like to see. This was a fairly small DLC, so again, I feel fairly indifferent to its inclusion in CK3. I don't think I've seen anyone commenting that they miss Charlemagne specifically, but rather miss the option to have those earlier start dates. Start dates, Paradox, please just give us more. Our last and I guess smallest DLC for this video is Way of Life, the 9th DLC for CK2, which released December of 2014 and added 10 focuses for the players to give their ruler, hundreds of new events, and a variety of new diplomatic interactions from dueling someone to seducing and breaking up with them. In CK3, we can put a focus on as a child of our characters or when they're adults, although now this is just 5 trees, which I personally don't mind because 10 is a lot. Some of the other traits like hunting were added with tours and tournaments, and it seems Paradox wants to give players a chance to level those separately given CK3's more RPG focus. We also have the diplomatic interactions already, and the events, while they might not have all returned, are there as well. This is one of those DLCs that because it's small, they included most of it anyway. Feels a bit anticlimactic to end on this one since, it's one of the smaller DLCs Paradox released for CK2, although with 8 other fairly content-heavy DLCs released in just under 3 years, that's not a huge issue in my mind. Alright, we've looked at the individual DLC, what we have in CK3, and what we're still looking for, so we can finally come to a verdict. Sunset Invasion is absent, but really who cares? But the Republics are 2, which is a major sore spot for me, yet that's just 2 out of 9 DLCs that Paradox has more or less not included in CK3. Yes, some of those features are not fully carried over, the Byzantines and religious ones seem to be the biggest offenders, but I think what I take away from this, if anything, to my surprise, is just how much we already got in CK3 from CK2. Remember, CK2 didn't have any of this stuff at launch, CK3 already does. I get a lot of comments about CK3 being inferior, and maybe in some ways that's true due to some of the popular DLC features that came out around years 5 and 6 for CK2, but I do feel that when I look at it from this angle, you can see that CK3 has a very solid foundation already. Now, does that excuse the fact that in all seriousness, we only got 4 DLC of actual substance in 3 years post-launch? Not really. Paradox has made a more complicated and feature-heavy product in CK3 from jump, but for me, and evidently for many of you fans, it does not excuse or make light the fact that this is a game that desperately needs more content. It needs substance. As someone who has recently jumped into Victoria 3 with the desire to cover that too on this channel, I've quickly found that its complicated at first systems are only about an inch deep, besides the economy, which is insane, and this trend of oversimplification needs to be addressed before it gets out of hand. I personally have faith that Paradox will deliver quality updates as we go through the CK3's life, as we've already seen, but I do worry that in some ways they are afraid to experiment with DLC like they did with CK2. Maybe Chapter 3 will hold some long overdue returns from CK3, or features we couldn't believe we never had. Either way, I hope this video was helpful in clarifying where these 2 games were at year 3, so perhaps you give CK3 some slack while also keeping up the good fight and insisting on the return of those features we all miss so dearly. But that is going to be it for me. If you like this video, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, as it helps me and YouTube know you'd like to see more of this content going forward. I'm sorry if my voice sounded like shit in this video. I am sick, and I can no longer wait to fully recover. It's been like 2 weeks, and I don't care anymore. If you have any ideas for future videos or feel I've left something out of this one, feel free to leave it in a comment or hop on over to our community Discord with the link in the description. Likewise, if you'd like to support the channel, I do offer 2 levels of membership, which you can see from the Join tab. I appreciate all of you immensely for the support. Here are our members. Thank you once again for watching. I'm Soul. This has been another CK3 video, and I will happily see you in the next one.